Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be tackling a pretty big topic,
Oh, yeah.
the lasting impact of Donald Trump's presidency on the world.
I think it's going to be a fascinating one.
Absolutely. And we've got so much to dig into from expert analyses and reports.
Yeah, from all across the globe.
Exactly. We've got stuff on trade wars,
Shifting alliances.
geopolitics, you name it.
All the good stuff.
The goal here is to go way beyond the headlines. You know what I mean?
Totally. We're looking for those truly significant, long-lasting changes he set in motion
Exactly.
that are still shaping the world today, even though his presidency is over.
Okay, so one of the first things that comes to mind
Hit me.
is the trade war with China.
Oh, yeah. Tariff man, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
He really embraced that persona and used some super aggressive tactics
Absolutely.
to try to address those issues with trade deficits and intellectual property concerns.
Right. Those had been simmering for decades.
So my question is, did he actually disrupt the system, or was this conflict inevitable?
Well, it's a really good question, and honestly, it's a bit of both.
Okay, interesting.
You see, the U.S. and China were already on this trajectory towards competition for economic and technological dominance. It was happening slowly, but then
Trump came in and just like,
poured gasoline on the fire.
exactly. He brought that fight out into the open and accelerated everything.
And the consequences of that are still being felt today.
Oh, absolutely. And they reach far beyond economics.
Right, like with that whole Huawei 5G controversy.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
This wasn't just about smartphones.
No, it was much bigger than that.
It was a battle for control over the future of the internet, the digital landscape, the whole thing.
Exactly. And it's still playing out right now.
Yeah.
Think about how this tech war is already affecting you.
Hmm.
Like your phone, your data privacy, the information you see online,
It's all connected.
all of it.
Yeah.
These are the new battlegrounds in this kind of conflict. It's a really big deal.
Okay, so beyond trade, Trump's approach to diplomacy had a huge impact on U.S. alliances, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Let's start with Europe.
It always felt like he was stirring the pot with his tough talk on NATO and those trade disputes.
Right. He definitely ruffled some feathers.
But did those core institutions really weaken?
You know, it's funny because it almost seems like he unintentionally made Europe stronger.
Really?
He rattled those cages, sure, but in doing so, he kind of pushed Europe toward more independence strategically.
Interesting.
They started thinking more about their own defense and relying less on the U.S.
So like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Kinda,
Yeah.
yeah. It backfired in a way.
Okay, so then there's South Asia.
Another complex region for sure.
Trump's whole strategy in Afghanistan felt more about getting out of the forever war than anything else.
More about ending it than fundamentally changing U.S. interests there.
Right. But then you have his approach to Pakistan, which was definitely different.
Very different. We saw those aid cuts initially and then a kind of reset.
And what did all that mean for India?
Right. How did that affect India's role in the region?
It's a complicated dynamic for sure.
Trump was definitely more transactional in his diplomacy than previous presidents.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if that was just a Trump thing or a sign of some deeper power shift happening globally.
It's definitely something to think about as we look at other regions.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about some areas that don't always get as much attention when we talk about Trump's foreign policy,
Sounds good.
like East and Southeast Asia.
Arr.
His actions seem to embolden those countries that were already wary of China's growing power.
Oh, absolutely. That was a key theme in the region for sure.
Do you have any specific examples?
Well, we saw the strengthening of the Quad.
Remind me who's in that again?
That's the alliance between Japan, India, Australia, and the U.S.
Right.
It's all about promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Basically pushing back against China.
Exactly. And then we have ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Right.
Their stance on the Indo-Pacific is evolving too, and they're becoming a more crucial player.
So a lot of moving pieces in that region.
Oh, yeah. It's a dynamic part of the world for sure.
Okay, now let's talk about Central Asia, a region that often gets overlooked.
Agreed. It doesn't always get the attention it deserves.
It seemed like Trump's strategy there was more reactive than proactive.
Yeah, more responding to events than setting the agenda,
And that might have created an opening for China and Russia?
potentially.
Uh-huh.
And then you have the Uyghur issue, which adds another layer of complexity.
Right. That became a major point of tension between the U.S. and China.
Absolutely. So the question is, did the U.S. do enough to support human rights and counter Beijing's influence there?
It's a tough question.
There are no easy answers in that part of the world.
Moving on to Africa, it feels like there was a mix of continuity and change under Trump.
Definitely a mixed bag.
Some programs like the African Growth and Opportunity Act continued.
Providing some stability.
But his lack of personal engagement and some of his policies definitely caused some friction.
Yeah, some relationships were strained, for sure.
And then there's the whole potential troop withdrawal from Africa.
Right. I raised some eyebrows.
It makes you wonder if the U.S. was prioritizing great power competition at the expense of its interests in Africa.
It's a valid question and one that's still being debated.
Okay, lastly, let's talk about Latin America.
Right.
Immigration and drug trafficking seem to dominate his approach in the region,
Definitely big issues for him.
which led some really contentious policies, like the border wall and aid cuts.
Those were definitely controversial.
And of course, there's the USMCA trade deal that replaced NAFTA.
A signature achievement for Trump?
It was a big win for him, but did his tactics hurt long-term relationships in the region?
That's the question, isn't it?
It's a delicate balance.
It always is in diplomacy.
So we've covered a lot of ground
I've
geographically,
been all over the map.
but I think we're starting to see some common threads emerge.
Oh, definitely.
What do you see as the big takeaway so far?
Well, one of the biggest is that Trump's presidency put a real strain on the multilateral system.
The system of global cooperation.
Exactly. His America First approach challenged the world order in a way we haven't seen in a long time.
Like when he pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
He even threatened to withdraw from the World Trade Organization.
It was a pretty radical shift.
It really was. And it raises a big question.
What's that?
Is this just a temporary blip or a sign of a much deeper shift in global governance?
Right, because when the U.S. withdraws from key institutions,
Mm-hmm.
it creates a vacuum.
And someone else is going to fill it.
You're talking about China, right?
Exactly. They've been getting more and more assertive in promoting their own vision of global order.
And that vision might not align with the U.S. or its allies.
It's a different model for sure, and one that raises a lot of questions about the future.
Okay, so we've talked about trade alliances and global cooperation.
A lot to unpack.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore before we move on to part 2.
What's that?
The impact of Trump's policies on global trade.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
We'll dive into that in more detail next time.
Can't wait.
But for now, thanks for joining us for part 1 of our deep dive.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore the world of geotechnology and how Trump's policies shaped that landscape.
It's going to be a good one.
See you next time. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We just finished talking about all the strain Trump's America First approach put on the global system.
Definitely shook things up.
Yeah. And for this part of our deep dive, I want to focus in on one area in particular that really heated up during his presidency, geotechnology.
Okay.
Control over technology, especially the next generation of internet tech 5G, is becoming a key element of global power.
We touched on Huawei earlier. And, it's not just about who makes the best smartphones or anything like that.
No.
It's about who controls the very infrastructure.
Yeah, the foundation of the future internet,
Mm-hmm.
the flow of data, and ultimately who shapes the digital landscape.
Exactly. And this is where that rivalry between the U.S. and China we were talking about really goes into overdrive. The Trump administration was incredibly aggressive in trying to block Huawei's 5G expansion.
Right. They were citing national security risks.
Yeah.
They were particularly concerned about Huawei's ties to the Chinese government,
Mm-hmm.
suggesting there was a real risk of espionage data theft.
Yeah.
They went so far as to pressure allies to ban Huawei from their 5G networks completely.
It was a hard line for sure. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a battle over the technology itself. It's an ideological battle, too. The U.S. is framing this as a fight between democracy and authoritarianism.
With the future of the internet hanging in the balance.
Exactly. Pretty high-stakes stuff.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so let's bring it back down to earth a little bit. How does this tech war actually impact you and me, the everyday person?
Well, it affects everything from how fast and reliable your internet connection is to the security of your personal data. It even raises questions about the future of innovation. Well, who's going to control the technologies that shape our lives? It's something we all need to be paying more attention to.
I agree. Okay, shifting gears a little bit, I want to bring up something we touched on earlier in part 1. Trump's approach to Iran, particularly his decision to pull the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal.
That was a huge decision.
It was. That was a move that sent shockwaves through the Middle East and beyond. What do you think were the biggest implications of that?
Well, remember, that deal had been so carefully negotiated by the Obama administration, it was considered a huge diplomatic achievement.
Right.
For Trump to just walk away from it like that sent a very strong signal
To everyone.
to the world.
It definitely heightened tensions with Iran,
Absolutely.
led to more sanctions,
Yeah.
and even raised the possibility of military conflict.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what were the implications for the U.S. relationship with its allies, especially those in Europe?
Many European countries who were also part of that deal strongly opposed Trump's decision.
I imagine so.
And it put a strain on those alliances for sure. It raised a lot of questions about whether the U.S. could be trusted as a partner.
And of course, it's worth pointing out that this move also pushed Iran closer to China.
Of course.
They recently signed a major strategic agreement.
Yeah, a big one.
And that has the potential to totally reshape the balance of power in the region.
Yeah. I think this really gets to the heart of the way the global landscape is changing.
Mhm.
Whether intentional or not, a lot of Trump's actions often had the effect of pushing countries closer together, sometimes in ways that no one could have really predicted.
I think that's a really good point. It's interesting how so much of Trump's foreign policy seemed to be driven by this desire to kind of overturn the legacy of Barack Obama.
Yeah, you see that pattern pretty clearly. From the Iran deal to the Paris Climate Accord,
Right.
there was a real sense that he wanted to undo what Obama had done.
And speaking of climate change, let's talk about the Paris Agreement for a minute.
That was another huge decision.
It was. His decision to pull the U.S. out of that agreement was incredibly controversial,
Yeah.
to say the least. What do you think the long-term consequences of that move will be?
Well, I think it was a major setback for the global effort to address climate change.
Mm-hmm.
It signaled that the U.S., under his leadership, was no longer interested in being a leader in that global effort.
Which I imagine upset a lot of people,
It did.
especially those who had worked so hard to negotiate that agreement in the first place.
Yeah, and it damaged relationships with countries who were committed to the agreement.
It felt like a real step backwards for global cooperation.
Some of his supporters applauded his decision. They argued that he was putting America first and prioritizing national interests over global interests. But many others saw it as a dangerous retreat from global leadership,
Yep.
a betrayal even of U.S. commitments.
It's interesting how Trump's actions really sparked this whole debate about the future of global governance.
Yeah.
With the U.S. seemingly stepping back from its traditional leadership role, is there a risk that other countries will step in to fill that void, potentially in ways that don't really align with U.S. interests or values?
That's a valid concern for sure. China, for example, has been much more assertive lately in promoting its own vision of global order,
Right.
one that many see as more authoritarian and less focused on things like human rights and democracy.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the big players, the U.S., China, Europe, but let's zoom in on a region that often gets overlooked in these discussions, Oceania.
Yeah, what's going on down there?
Well, Oceania is interesting because it highlights how complex this global landscape really is.
Oh, so.
Australia, in particular, finds itself in a very tricky position.
Oh, yeah.
They want to maintain those strong security ties with the U.S., but they also rely heavily on China economically.
It's a tough balancing act.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think it's a perfect example of how Trump's actions, even if they were focused on other parts of the world, had ripple effects everywhere,
Oh, yeah.
forcing countries to make tough choices.
Definitely. It brings up another key theme that we've seen throughout Trump's presidency, the challenge of balancing national interests with global responsibilities.
It's a tension that's always been there, but it felt especially acute during his time in office.
Right. It's like every country is trying to figure out how to navigate this new world order where the old rules don't apply anymore.
It's a world where power is more diffuse, alliances are shifting, and the lines between cooperation and competition are getting really blurry.
Exactly. And it's a world that I think demands a new kind of leadership, one that's both pragmatic and principled.
Okay, I think that's a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to unpack. So in part 3, we'll finish up this exploration of Trump's legacy with some final thoughts and takeaways for our listeners. All right, welcome back to the deep dive for the final part of our look at Donald Trump's global impact.
It's amazing how much ground we've covered.
I know, right? From trade wars to those shifting alliances,
The rise of China, the whole thing with global cooperation.
and even that new battleground in tech.
Yeah, the digital sphere.
It's a lot.
It really shows how Trump's America First approach his style of deal making.
And let's be honest,
Yeah.
Those often unpredictable actions really left a mark on the world.
On pretty much every corner of it.
So, as we wrap up, what are the big takeaways for our listeners? What's a big picture we should all be thinking about?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that Trump's presidency was a period of huge disruption for the whole global order.
Like a real shakeup.
Yeah, it forced countries to step back and really reevaluate their relationships.
And their priorities?
Exactly. And even though he's been out of office for a while now, we're still feeling the impact of those disruptions.
Yeah, we see it in those ongoing trade tensions with China
for
and those shifting alliances we talked about. And I think it just shows how countries are having to figure out how to navigate this new world.
It's a much more complex world,
Yeah.
a lot more uncertain.
And a lot more competitive.
Definitely. And what's interesting is these changes aren't just happening out there somewhere.
Right.
They're affecting us all right here, right now.
How so?
Think about the technology we're using right now.
Okay.
The products we buy every day, the news we read.
It's all connected.
It really is. It's all connected to these global shifts.
So what does this mean for the future? What's coming next?
Well, if there's one thing we know about the future, it's that it's impossible to predict with absolute certainty.
Fair enough.
But I do think it's safe to say that the world has fundamentally changed.
In what way?
We're in this multipolar world now. Power's more spread out.
Not concentrated in one place.
Right. And those old rules of the game, they don't really apply anymore.
Interesting.
It's a world where it's hard to tell what's cooperation and what's competition. And I think every country is trying to figure out where they fit in all of this.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. It can feel overwhelming at times.
It does. So where do we even begin? How do we make sense of all these complex forces that are shaping the world?
Well, for me, it always starts with curiosity. Just keep learning and exploring.
Like you're doing here.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to connect the dots. See how things fit together. The more we understand about how the world works,
The better off we'll be.
the better equipped we'll be to handle those challenges. And you know what?
What?
Grab those opportunities that pop up.
That's a great point. It really speaks to what we try to do here on the Deep Dive.
Totally.
We want to give our listeners the knowledge and insights they need
So they can engage with the world in a more informed way.
and hopefully make a difference.
Because we're all in this together, right? The choices we make as individuals, as a society, they determine what the future's going to look like.
Absolutely. So to sum it all up, I think we can say that Donald Trump's presidency really was a catalyst for massive change globally.
Yeah, it was a period of real disruption that shook things up, and we're still dealing with the consequences of those changes.
But it's not all about Trump.
Right.
His presidency just brought a lot of these underlying shifts to the surface.
Yeah, things that were already happening.
The rise of new global players.
Yeah.
The fact that people were losing trust in those old institutions.
And the fact that technology is changing everything so quickly.
Right. And those shifts, they're going to continue to reshape the world moving forward.
Right.
It's really up to all of us to pay attention and do what we can to shape the future we want to see.
And never stop asking questions.
So true. The more we understand about the world,
The better prepared we'll be to deal with those challenges and take advantage of all the opportunities that come our way.
I love that. Well said. Well, everyone, I think that about wraps it up for this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this fascinating journey. It's been a pleasure having you along for the ride.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
And remember, the world is a complex and ever-changing place. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.